Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one nobody even notices. The fluorescent lights above the naval base cafeteria buzzed softly at 6:12 a.m., casting pale reflections across rows of metal tables still damp from the morning cleaning. Most of the soldiers grabbing breakfast barely looked up as they passed through the line, boots echoing against the tile floor, coffee steaming in their hands. At the far corner of the room, pushing a gray mop bucket across the floor with steady, unhurried steps, was Daniel Carter. To most people on base, he was just the janitor, a quiet middle-aged single dad who cleaned hallways, wiped tables, and disappeared before anyone thought to learn his name. His faded work shirt carried a small stitch tag that read Carter, though few ever noticed it. Daniel liked it that way. Invisible meant peaceful. Invisible meant no questions about the past. He wrung the mop slowly, the water swirling in the bucket, when his eyes caught something unusual near the breakfast line. A young soldier sat alone at the end of a long table, her tray empty except for a small paper cup of water. She looked barely older than 20. Her navy uniform was neat but worn at the edges, sleeves rolled carefully, posture straight despite the tired shadows under her eyes. Around her, the room buzzed with quiet conversations. But her table remained empty. One group of soldiers walked past and glanced at her tray. One of them chuckled. "Guess payday's still a few miles away, rookie." Another muttered something under his breath, and the group moved on, laughter fading into the cafeteria noise. The young soldier didn't respond. She just stared at the table, fingers wrapped around the water cup like she was pretending it was enough. Daniel watched for a moment. Then another. He didn't rush. He finished wiping the table beside him, folded the cloth neatly, and walked back to the janitor closet near the hallway. Inside sat a small brown paper bag. His breakfast. 2 scrambled egg sandwiches wrapped in foil, and a cup of coffee he had poured before sunrise in his tiny kitchen 12 miles off base. He had made them early that morning before waking his 9-year-old daughter for school. It wasn't much, but it was enough to carry him through the shift. Daniel stood there for a quiet second, holding the bag. Then he turned around and walked back into the cafeteria. The room was louder now, trays clattering, boots moving, voices bouncing off the walls. The young soldier was still sitting alone. Daniel approached her table slowly and placed the brown paper bag in front of her. She blinked, surprised, looking up at the janitor standing beside her. "Sir, I can't take that," she said quickly, glancing at the bag. Daniel offered a small, calm smile. "A soldier shouldn't start the day hungry," he said gently. "Besides, coffee tastes better when someone else enjoys the breakfast." A couple soldiers nearby snickered quietly. One leaned toward another and whispered, "Look at that, janitor playing hero." Daniel didn't look at them. He simply slid the bag a little closer to the young soldier and picked up his mop again. The young woman hesitated, staring at the warm foil wrapping like she couldn't believe it was real. Daniel turned back toward the floor he had been cleaning, pushing the mop slowly across the tile, like nothing unusual had happened at all. But as he walked away, the young soldier opened the bag carefully, and for the first time that morning, the room grew just a little quieter. The young soldier held the warm foil in both hands as if it were something fragile and rare, the smell of eggs and toast rising gently into the air. For a moment, she did not move. Around her, the cafeteria continued its usual rhythm, trays sliding along metal rails, coffee machines hissing softly, boots tapping against tile. But something about the small brown bag on the table made the noise feel distant. She slowly opened the foil and stared at the sandwich like it was the first real meal she had seen in days. Across the room, Daniel Carter kept working, pushing the mop in slow, even strokes, his eyes focused on the floor like it was the most important job in the building. He did not look back. He did not wait for thanks. That was not why he had done it. At the table, the young soldier finally took a careful bite. The warmth seemed to reach her immediately, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if her body had been waiting for permission to breathe again. She glanced toward the janitor across the cafeteria, studying the way he moved. Something about him did not match. The simple uniform he wore. His posture was too straight. His movements too calm. Even the way he turned the mop in his hands looked precise, almost practiced. She had seen that kind of quiet control before during training drills. One of the soldiers from earlier walked past again and noticed the food. He raised an eyebrow. "Looks like maintenance crew runs the kitchen now," he joked, nudging his friend. Another soldier laughed. Guess the janitor thinks he is part of the unit. Their laughter drifted across the room. The young soldier lowered her eyes, but did not respond. Instead, she took another bite, slower this time, as if she wanted to make the moment last. Daniel heard the laughter, but did not react. He simply rinsed the mop, wrung it carefully, and continued down the row of tables. The fluorescent lights above reflected off the clean floor behind him like a quiet trail. One of the kitchen workers leaned against the counter watching the scene unfold. "You did not have to give that away," he muttered quietly when Daniel passed by. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Breakfast is only important if someone eats it," he replied. The worker shook his head with a faint smile, not quite understanding. At the table, the young soldier finished the sandwich and folded the foil neatly like it mattered. She stood up slowly, brushing invisible crumbs from her sleeve before walking toward the janitor. Daniel was already pushing the bucket toward the far hallway when she caught up. "Sir," she said softly. Daniel stopped and turned, resting both hands on the mop handle. Up close, his face looked older than she expected, lines near his eyes that suggested years of early mornings and long days. But his expression carried a calm steadiness that felt strangely reassuring. "Thank you," she said. Daniel gave a small nod as if the words were unnecessary. "You looked like you had a long morning," he replied. She hesitated before speaking again. "How did you know I had not eaten?" Daniel glanced briefly toward the empty tables behind them. "People who are not hungry do not stare at food lines for 10 minutes, he said simply. The young soldier blinked in surprise at the quiet observation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway lights hummed softly overhead. Finally, she extended her hand. "My name is Emily Hayes." Daniel shook her hand once, firm but brief. "Daniel Carter," he said. Then he picked up the mop again and continued down the corridor, leaving Emily standing there with the strange feeling that the janitor who had given away his breakfast was someone far more interesting than anyone else in the building. Emily Hayes stood for a moment in the quiet hallway after Daniel Carter disappeared around the corner with his mop bucket. The smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread still lingered faintly in the air, but what stayed with her more was the strange calm in the janitor's voice. Most people on base moved fast, talked loud, and tried very hard to prove something. But Daniel Carter had done the opposite. He had simply given away his breakfast and walked back to work like it was nothing worth remembering. Emily returned slowly to the cafeteria, the folded foil still in her hand. The room had thinned out now as the early morning rush moved toward training drills and morning briefings. Sunlight pushed through the tall windows along the east wall, spreading across the clean tile floor like a pale ribbon of gold. She dropped the empty foil into the trash and filled her water cup again, thinking about the way Daniel had noticed she had not eaten. That kind of attention usually belonged to officers who had spent years studying the people around them. It did not belong to janitors. 2 soldiers from earlier were still sitting near the coffee machine, finishing the last of their breakfast. One of them spotted her walking back through the room. "Looks like the janitor saved the day," he said with a half-smile that carried more sarcasm than kindness. His friend chuckled. "Careful. Next thing you know, they will promote him to sergeant." Emily paused beside their table. She could feel the old familiar pressure in the room, the quiet expectation that she would either laugh along or keep walking. Instead, she spoke calmly. "He showed more respect in 5 seconds than most people do all morning." The soldiers exchanged surprised looks. One of them shrugged and lifted his coffee cup. "Relax. It was just a joke." Emily did not argue. She simply walked away, but inside her curiosity had grown stronger. After a few minutes, she stepped out of the cafeteria and into the long corridor that connected the dining hall to the administrative wing. The hallway stretched nearly 100 feet, lined with gray lockers and framed photographs of naval ships and decorated officers. The floor looked freshly cleaned, the faint scent of soap still hanging in the air. Halfway down the corridor, she saw Daniel again. He was kneeling beside the wall, wiping the baseboard carefully with a cloth, his mop bucket parked beside him. The way he worked was quiet and deliberate, like he believed every small detail mattered. Emily slowed her steps, watching him for a second before speaking. "You work like you have done this a long time." Daniel looked up and gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Long enough to know the floor tells the truth," he replied. Emily tilted her head slightly. "What does that mean?" Daniel stood and rinsed the cloth in the bucket. "If people are rushing, the floor shows it. If they respect the place, it stays clean." Emily considered the answer, realizing it sounded less like janitor talk and more like something an instructor might say during leadership training. She glanced at the photographs lining the hallway walls. Most of them showed admirals standing proudly beside massive ships, their uniforms covered with medals. When she looked back at Daniel, he had already returned to wiping the floor, calm and focused. "You notice things most people ignore," she said quietly. Daniel shrugged again, almost shyly. "You learn a lot when people assume you are not important enough to listen." Emily studied him for another moment, sensing there was a story behind that sentence. But before she could ask anything else, a loudspeaker crackled overhead, and a voice echoed through the corridor announcing that a high-level inspection would begin later that morning. Daniel did not react to the announcement at all. He simply wrung the cloth, placed it neatly over the bucket handle, and continued cleaning the hallway as if the most important event of the day had already happened when a hungry soldier finally ate breakfast. The announcement from the loudspeaker echoed through the corridor again, sharper this time, reminding everyone on base that a high-level inspection would begin within the hour. Doors opened along the hallway as officers stepped out of their offices adjusting their uniforms and speaking quickly into radios. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. What had been a quiet morning suddenly felt tense, like the entire building had taken a deep breath and forgotten how to exhale. Emily Hayes stood near the wall watching the sudden change. She had only been assigned to the base for 3 weeks, but she already understood that inspections were serious. Shoes were polished. Uniforms were straightened. Every hallway needed to look perfect. She glanced down the corridor where Daniel Carter continued cleaning the floor with the same slow rhythm he had used all morning. The tension in the air did not seem to reach him. His mop moved across the tile in calm, even strokes, leaving a clean path behind him that reflected the overhead lights. A pair of junior officers hurried past Emily and nearly slipped as they tried to slow down near the wet floor. One of them looked at Daniel with irritation. "Hey, maintenance, you might want to finish this before the Admiral gets here," he said sharply. Daniel nodded once without lifting his eyes. "It will be dry before anyone important walks through," he replied quietly. The officers exchanged amused looks before continuing down the hall. Emily watched the interaction carefully. There was no frustration in Daniel's voice, no trace of embarrassment either. He simply said what needed to be said and returned to his work. A few minutes later, the hallway filled with more movement as sailors lined up along the walls preparing for the inspection route. Boots tapped against the floor. Radios crackled with short instructions. Someone near the stairwell whispered that the visiting officer was one of the highest-ranking leaders in the entire fleet. Emily felt the familiar pressure tighten in her chest. She straightened her uniform and checked the crease in her sleeve, suddenly aware that every small detail mattered. Across the corridor, Daniel finished rinsing the mop and rolled the bucket slowly toward the supply closet near the end of the hall. Emily noticed something strange as he walked. His shoulders stayed perfectly level, his pace steady, the kind of natural discipline she had only seen in experienced officers during formation drills. It was subtle, but it stood out. She stepped closer as he passed by. "You are not nervous about the inspection," she said quietly. Daniel paused beside the closet door and considered the question. "Inspections are just another way to see what is already there," he answered. Emily frowned slightly. "Most people are acting like the entire base might collapse if something is out of place." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile as he placed the mop inside the closet. "If a place runs well every day, inspections do not change much," he said. Emily studied his expression for a moment, noticing again that calm steadiness that seemed completely untouched by the rising tension around them. Down the hallway, a senior officer suddenly called for everyone to take their positions along the corridor. The inspection party was approaching from the main entrance. Conversations faded immediately. The hallway that had been full of movement only seconds earlier became silent, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Sailors stood straight along the walls, eyes forward, hands behind their backs. Emily took her place near the center of the corridor, her heart beating faster now. At the far end, Daniel stepped quietly out of the supply closet and closed the door behind him. Instead of leaving the hallway, he simply stood near the wall beside the cleaning cart, calm and still like he belonged exactly where he was. The distant sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the building. One officer, 2 officers, then several more. The inspection group was almost here. Emily kept her eyes forward the way she had been trained, but in the corner of her vision, she could still see Daniel Carter standing beside his cart, completely relaxed while the rest of the corridor held its breath waiting for the arrival of the most powerful officer on base. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder with every passing second, steady and deliberate, echoing down the long corridor like a slow drumbeat. The sailors along the wall stood motionless, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Even the air felt tighter now. Emily Hayes could hear her own breathing as she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead the way training demanded. The inspection party appeared at the far end of the hallway, a small group of officers walking in formation around a tall figure in the center whose crisp white uniform caught the light with every step. Conversations had vanished entirely. The only sound left was the quiet rhythm of polished shoes meeting the floor. The senior officers beside the central figure spoke in low voices, pointing occasionally toward different parts of the building as they moved forward. Every few steps the lead officer glanced left and right, scanning the corridor with calm, experienced eyes. The group passed the first line of sailors, then the second, their presence filling the hallway with a quiet authority that no one dared interrupt. Emily felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She had heard about inspections like this during training, but had never stood in one before. Everything about the moment felt larger than life, like the building itself was standing at attention. The inspection group continued forward, moving closer with each second. 20 feet away. 15. 10. Emily kept her posture steady, but her eyes flickered for the briefest moment toward the far wall where Daniel Carter stood beside his cleaning cart. He had not moved. His hands rested lightly on the handle of the cart, his shoulders relaxed, his expression calm, as if he were simply waiting for the hallway to clear before returning to work. The officers reached the section of the corridor where Emily was standing. One of them paused briefly to examine a framed photograph of a naval vessel hanging on the wall, nodding once before continuing forward. The tall officer in the center walked slowly, observing everything with careful attention. His presence carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades at sea and knew exactly what discipline looked like. Emily felt the group drawing closer to where Daniel stood. 5 feet away now. The tall officer continued walking past another pair of sailors, and then took one more step forward. Suddenly he stopped. The motion was so unexpected that several officers behind him nearly collided before catching themselves. The hallway froze instantly. Emily felt the silence deepen around her, as every sailor held perfectly still. The tall officer had stopped directly in front of the cleaning cart. For a moment he said nothing. His eyes rested on Daniel Carter, studying him carefully. Daniel did not shift his stance. He simply stood there, meeting the officer's gaze with quiet calm. The surrounding officers looked confused. One of them cleared his throat softly, as if expecting the janitor to step aside or offer an explanation for standing in the inspection path. But Daniel remained exactly where he was. Emily could feel the tension building like pressure in the air before a storm. The tall officer took a slow step closer to Daniel. His expression changed in a way that no one in the hallway expected. The sharp formality in his face softened, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. He studied Daniel for another silent second. Then, without warning, the highest-ranking officer in the building stood tall and raised his hand in a crisp naval salute directly toward the janitor beside the cleaning cart. For a brief heartbeat, the entire corridor forgot how to breathe. For one long silent second, no one in the corridor moved. The Admiral's salute hung in the air like a moment frozen in time. Sailors along the wall stared straight ahead, but their eyes widened slightly, unsure if they had seen correctly. Officers behind the Admiral exchanged confused glances, their disciplined composure slipping just enough to reveal their surprise. No one saluted a janitor. That simply did not happen. Daniel Carter looked at the raised hand in front of him, and for a brief moment his calm expression softened with recognition. Slowly, with the same steady control he had shown all morning, he straightened his shoulders and returned the salute with quiet precision. The motion was crisp, practiced, and unmistakably professional. The Admiral lowered his hand and studied Daniel closely, the hint of a smile forming at the edge of his expression. "I thought that was you," he said in a low voice that carried easily through the silent corridor. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, unsure what they were witnessing. One of them leaned slightly toward another and whispered something under his breath, but the Admiral's attention never left Daniel. Emily Hayes stood frozen along the wall, her mind racing. She had seen many salutes during training, but something about the way the two men had exchanged that simple gesture felt different. It carried weight, history, and respect that went far beyond rank. The Admiral took one step closer to the cleaning cart and looked directly at Daniel. "It has been a long time, Carter," he said. Daniel nodded once, his voice calm. "Yes, sir. It has been a few years." The Admiral glanced briefly at the mop bucket beside him and then back to Daniel's face. "Never imagined I would find you running maintenance on one of my bases," he said. Daniel's expression remained composed. "It is honest work," he replied quietly. A few sailors along the corridor struggled to hide their confusion. Officers shifted slightly in place, their attention now fully fixed on the exchange. Emily could feel the entire hallway leaning into the moment, even though no one dared move a muscle. The Admiral studied Daniel for another moment, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something in his memory. "Still calm under pressure," he said softly. "Some things do not change." Daniel gave the faintest hint of a smile, but did not respond. The Admiral turned slightly and looked down the hallway, his eyes briefly passing over the rows of sailors standing along the walls. When his gaze reached Emily Hayes, he paused. Recognition flickered across his face almost instantly. Emily felt her heart skip as the Admiral's expression softened in a way that was very different from the formal inspection demeanor he had shown moments earlier. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said evenly. Emily straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir." The Admiral gestured gently toward Daniel Carter beside the cleaning cart. "It appears you have already met one of the most remarkable sailors I ever served with." The corridor seemed to grow even quieter. Emily glanced at Daniel, stunned. The janitor who had given away his breakfast stood there as calmly as before, as if the entire conversation were the most ordinary thing in the world. The Admiral folded his hands behind his back and continued speaking, his voice carrying a tone of deep respect. "Many years ago," he said slowly, "this man showed the kind of leadership that no rank can teach." The officers around him stood perfectly still now, listening carefully. Emily could feel the weight of the moment settling over the hallway as the realization slowly began to spread. The quiet janitor beside the cleaning cart was not just another worker on base. And whatever story the Admiral was about to tell was important enough to make an entire corridor full of soldiers forget about the inspection completely. The Admiral's words settled into the silent corridor like a weight that no one could ignore. Officers who had arrived expecting a routine inspection now stood perfectly still, their attention fixed entirely on the quiet man beside the cleaning cart. Daniel Carter remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the handle as if none of the attention belonged to him. The Admiral turned slightly, so the line of sailors could hear him clearly, his voice steady and deliberate. "Many years ago," he continued, "our fleet was caught in a situation that tested every person on board. Confusion, pressure, and difficult decisions filled the room." He paused briefly, his eyes returning to Daniel. And in that moment, one sailor reminded everyone what real leadership looks like. A few officers shifted subtly, trying to place the story in their memory. Emily Hayes listened carefully, her curiosity growing with every word. She had studied countless examples of naval leadership during training, but none of them had ever mentioned a janitor standing in a hallway with a mop bucket. The Admiral nodded once toward Daniel. While others were focused on rank and authority, Carter was focused on people, he said. He kept everyone calm, steady, and thinking clearly when the room needed it most. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly, as if the attention felt uncomfortable. The Admiral noticed and gave a small respectful smile. "You see," he continued, addressing the sailors in the hallway, "rank can give someone authority, but character is what earns respect." The corridor remained silent except for the soft hum of lights overhead. Emily could feel the shift happening around her. The same soldiers who had laughed earlier in the cafeteria were now staring at Daniel Carter with a completely different expression. One officer near the back cleared his throat quietly. "Sir," he said carefully, "I was not aware Mr. Carter had served under your command." The Admiral glanced toward the officer and nodded once. "Most people here would not be aware," he replied, "because Carter never felt the need to talk about it." The Admiral stepped half a pace closer to Daniel, and lowered his voice slightly, though everyone could still hear him. "There are moments in a career that stay with you forever," he said. "Moments when you see someone act with the kind of calm judgment that others remember for the rest of their lives." He looked down briefly at the cleaning cart beside Daniel, and then back to the man himself. Carter showed that kind of judgment. Emily felt a quiet realization forming in her mind. The same calm presence she had noticed earlier in the cafeteria, the same steady way Daniel observed people and situations, suddenly made perfect sense. The Admiral turned back toward the line of sailors and gestured lightly toward Daniel. "This man reminds us that leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room," he said. "Sometimes it is about being the calmest." A faint murmur of understanding passed through the hallway before fading again into respectful silence. Daniel shifted his weight slightly and spoke for the first time since the Admiral began explaining the past. His voice remained as quiet as it had been that morning. "Sir, I was simply doing my job." The Admiral gave a short, thoughtful laugh. "You always said that," he replied, "even when everyone else knew you had done something extraordinary." The corridor seemed to grow still again as the Admiral's gaze moved slowly down the line of sailors. When his eyes returned to Emily Hayes, his expression softened once more with a hint of pride. "And today," he said calmly, "it appears Carter is still doing exactly the same thing." Emily felt a sudden warmth in her chest as the meaning of the moment became clear. The man who had quietly given away his breakfast had never needed recognition to show respect. And now the entire corridor understood exactly why the Admiral had stopped walking the moment he saw him. The Admiral's final words lingered in the corridor long after he finished speaking. For a moment no one moved. The soldiers who had stood along the walls now looked at Daniel Carter in a completely different way, as if the quiet man beside the cleaning cart had suddenly stepped out of a story they had never known existed. Daniel, however, looked exactly the same as he had earlier that morning. Calm, quiet, almost uncomfortable with the attention gathering around him. The Admiral studied the corridor for a second before turning his eyes back toward Emily Hayes. His expression softened slightly, the firm command presence easing just enough to reveal something more personal. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said calmly. Emily straightened immediately. "Yes, sir." The Admiral nodded once and gestured gently toward Daniel Carter. "I believe you had breakfast this morning." Emily blinked in surprise at the unexpected question. "Yes, sir," she replied carefully. A faint smile touched the Admiral's face. "And I believe the man standing beside that cart made sure of it." Emily glanced toward Daniel again, the memory of the warm sandwich and brown paper bag flashing clearly in her mind. The corridor remained silent as the Admiral continued. "Carter has always had a way of noticing when someone needs help," he said quietly. "He does it without announcements, without expecting anything in return." Several officers shifted slightly as the meaning of the moment began to spread through the hallway. The Admiral turned his attention fully toward Emily now. "Lieutenant," he said, his tone calm but warm, "there is something else you should know." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. The Admiral gestured lightly between the two of them. "You see, Carter once reminded me of something I never forgot," he said. "Respect is not measured by rank. It is measured by how you treat the person standing next to you." Emily swallowed gently as the Admiral's words settled in. Daniel stood quietly, his eyes lowered slightly as if he would rather be anywhere else in that moment. The Admiral let the silence sit for a second before speaking again. "And this morning," he added, "he treated someone important with that same respect." The officers behind him looked puzzled. One of them glanced toward Emily as if trying to understand why the Admiral's attention had shifted to her so directly. The Admiral finally revealed the truth with a calm clarity that carried through the entire hallway. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said evenly, "is my daughter." The effect was immediate. Several officers blinked in disbelief. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the corridor as sailors along the wall struggled to keep their composure. Emily felt the words land like a sudden wave. She had been careful on this base never to mention her family name, never to use her father's position to influence the way others treated her. She had wanted to earn her place on her own. Now the entire hallway knew. The Admiral watched the reactions calmly before turning back toward Daniel Carter. "And this morning," he said with quiet appreciation, without knowing anything about her name or rank, Carter made sure she did not start her day hungry. The corridor grew silent again, But this time the silence felt different. It was no longer confusion. It was respect. Daniel lifted his eyes briefly and met the Admiral's gaze with the same calm humility he had carried all morning. "Anyone would have done the same, sir," he said softly. The Admiral shook his head slightly, his voice gentle but certain. "No," he replied. "Not everyone would have noticed." The Admiral's quiet answer settled over the corridor like the final note of a long song. For several seconds no one spoke. Sailors who had once seen Daniel Carter as nothing more than the man who cleaned their floors now looked at him with a completely different understanding. The hallway that had been tense with inspection anxiety only minutes earlier now felt calm, almost reflective. Daniel stood beside his cart just as he had before, one hand resting lightly on the handle, his expression steady and humble, as if the attention surrounding him still did not quite belong to him. The Admiral watched him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly with the kind of respect that could not be commanded by rank alone. "Carter," he said quietly, "it seems you have not changed at all." Daniel gave a small smile, the lines around his eyes softening slightly. "People still need breakfast, sir," he replied. A few sailors along the wall allowed themselves the smallest hint of a smile, the tension finally breaking in the room. The Admiral turned toward the line of officers behind him and spoke calmly. "This inspection is complete." The officers looked briefly surprised but immediately nodded in agreement. The Admiral gestured toward the hallway floor that Daniel had cleaned earlier that morning. "Everything here looks exactly the way a disciplined base should look," he said. Then he glanced back at Daniel. "And apparently it is being maintained by someone who understands discipline better than most." Emily Hayes stood silently, her thoughts still catching up with everything that had happened. She had arrived on base wanting to prove herself without leaning on her father's reputation. That morning she had expected another ordinary day of training and duty. Instead, she had discovered that the quiet man who gave away his breakfast carried a legacy of leadership that even an admiral respected. She stepped away from the wall and approached Daniel slowly. The hallway remained quiet as she stopped beside him. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel looked at her with the same calm expression he had shown earlier in the cafeteria. "You already said that," he replied gently. Emily nodded once. "I know, but now I understand why you noticed." Daniel shrugged slightly, almost shyly. "It is easier to see people clearly when you are not trying to impress anyone," he said. The Admiral watched the exchange with quiet pride before turning toward the officers waiting behind him. "Let us continue," he said calmly. The inspection group began walking again, their footsteps echoing down the corridor as they moved toward the next wing of the building. As they passed Daniel, several officers gave him a respectful nod. None of them joked about the janitor anymore. When the hallway finally cleared, the building slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Voices resumed. Doors opened. Radios crackled again. Daniel reached for his mop handle and pushed the cleaning cart forward like nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Emily remained standing there for a moment watching him work. The same quiet rhythm returned to his movements, steady and patient, as if every step of the morning had been just another part of an ordinary day. And in a way, it had been. Because to Daniel Carter, respect was never something reserved for important moments. It was simply the way you treated people every single day, whether anyone was watching or not.